Before we start today's video, I have a little announcement to make. I've been getting a lot of requests for a new Skillshare class, so here it is. I'm back with another food illustration, and this time I'll be painting a cozy cup of hot chocolate with thick chocolate syrup drizzled on top. In this class, I'll be including the drawing process as well as the references that I used to create this painting, and just like my usual Skillshare classes, I'll be dividing up the painting into smaller and shorter lessons, so the steps are much easier to follow along to, and it's also easier to take breaks in between if you decide to paint along. I will also have the outline available on Skillshare if you want to jump straight into painting, so those are the options for you guys. If you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can use the link in my description box for a free trial and watch all of the classes Skillshare has to offer, including all of my classes. So I hope to see you guys there if this is something you'll be interested in. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm back with more simple and quick Christmas card designs. This time I decided to pick a warm and cozy theme, and I'll be painting these puffy socks and puffy Christmas sweater. Let's get right into it by sketching out the first design, which are going to be the socks. I started by drawing out an arch with bows on either side to make it a bit more decorative, and I added more curved lines at the top crossing each other for the Christmas lights. Next, I'm going to draw out the socks. This was a bit tricky for me to get the angle and the correct puffiness. I tend to actually make mine a bit too puffy and it looks too dense and heavy for my liking. So when I'm drawing these socks, I really try to loosen up my drawing with as little pressure as possible for my pencil so I can keep erasing when I make adjustments. I actually ended up making the socks a little bit longer and thinner, but I can always make it more puffy as I paint it later by adding volume. As you can see, I'm making a lot of adjustments, and I try to just figure out what to do with each section if I want the top part to be thinner and such. And once I'm happy with the size and shape and how it looks and interacts with each other, I'm going to start adding the designs for the socks. For the one in the middle, I'm just going to add little pom-poms, and I think this will look really cute, and I'm going to make them a bit more three-dimensional later. And to make the pom-poms look like it's popping out, it also helps to draw some of these circles around the edges of the socks. I'm actually going to give a three-dimensional design for all three socks because I find that it looks cuter that way. So on the right hand side, I drew out the same circles again, but this time I'm going to turn them into berries by adding 2 leaves on top. As for the last one on the left, I'm going to create some pussy willows, and of course I'm going to also make them pop out of the socks. I like to play around with how many there are, so some branches might have 3 and some might have 2. Lastly, I'm going to write Merry Christmas at the bottom. You can use any font that you want, but I want to keep mine simple and kind of cartoony at the same time. Then, since there's still a bit of space at the bottom, I'm going to add some berries with leaves. Before painting, I want to make sure that all the lines are clean, so make sure you do that first. And before we start, I'm just going to mask off the design for the socks to make the painting process much easier. I'm using a masking fluid by Marie's, and it's really easy to apply, but it does have air bubbles for some reason even without me shaking the masking fluid. So I always have a needle right next to me to pop those air bubbles whenever I need to. I'm not going to mask the last sock because I'm going to use a darker color for the berries compared to the base of the sock. Next, here are the colors that I'm going to be using for this first design. Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Veremilion by Holbein, Mineral Violet by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Hooker's Green by Cotman, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. To outline some of the details later, I'm going to be using my colored pencil. This is by Faber-Castell and it's just a hobby grade. It doesn't have color names, but it just has the number. As for the writing later, I'm going to be using my Unipen Fine Line in the color brown and the size is 0.5. Before we start to paint, you have to make sure that the masking fluid is completely dry, so while you wait, you can also paint the one on the right beforehand, like what I'm doing here. The first color that I use is just buff titanium in a medium to thin consistency, and I'm just going to spread it out all over this sock. You can choose to paint on top of the berries or even avoid some of the spacing, but it doesn't really matter how neatly you do this since the berries are going to be a darker color. Once you've covered the whole area and the surface is still wet, I'm going to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency of buff titanium to dot in more of the thicker consistency at the bottom and the sides of the sock. After that, I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the sock in the middle. For this, I'm using a thin consistency of yellow ochre with buff titanium. And just like before, once you've covered the whole area and the surface is still a bit damp, I'm going to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency to dot in a slightly darker value. While I wait for the second sock to dry, I'm going to move back to the first sock where I added a bit of mineral violet to the buff titanium to darken it, and I'm just going to place it at the bottom of the sock. Now moving on to the base color of the sock on the left, I just added vermilion to the previous mineral violet and buff titanium mix, and I'm using a light to medium consistency to again cover the whole area of the sock. As you can tell, the surfaces are quite wet, so it's going to take a while to dry. So meanwhile, I'm going to move on to the sock in the middle, and the paint should settle by now, but it should still be damp. So I'm going to use a darker value, and this is from a mix of yellow ochre and mineral violet in a light consistency, and I'm going to place them under the pom-poms as well as the bottom part of the sock. Then I'm going to go back to the sock on the left using a mix of mineral violet with the previous base color red. I'm placing the darker colors again at the bottom of the sock as well as underneath the pussy willows that I masked off. For the cuff of the sock here, I use buff titanium with yellow ochre and mineral violet in a light consistency. Then moving on to the next cuff, I want to create a dark brown by using green mixed into the red with a little bit of yellow ochre. As for the last one, I'm going to use the same mixture, but I'm going to increase the ratio of yellow ochre, and this will make the brown a little bit more yellowish. To attach these socks on the string, I'm just going to use pegs, and I'm going to play with the colors a bit. For the one in the middle, I just used the light brown mix that I still had on my palette. For the one on the right, I added vermilion to the dark red mixture, and on the left, I use a dark green by mixing Hooker's green into the brown mix. Next, I'm going to add the shadows underneath the berries for the right sock, and for this I use a mix of buff titanium with yellow ochre and mineral violet in a very light consistency. And since the base color is now completely dry, I follow it up with a clean damp brush to soften the edges. As for the string and the bow, I use a really thick consistency mix of mineral violet and crimson lake. Once I'm done with the bow and the string, I'm going to go back to add more form or volume to these socks to make them look more puffy. So here I'm using the red that I used for the string at the bottom of the socks as well as the sides, leaving the top left a little bit lighter. And I'm also going to do the same with the other socks as well, using a darker version of the base color. This one has a bit of mineral violet, yellow ochre with a bit of the previous red and a bit of buff titanium. I'm just picking up the color that I already have on my palette, trying to find a color that was best suited for a darker version of the base color. As for the last one, I pretty much used the same mixture as before, but this time I added more buff titanium to suit the base color a bit more. While I'm applying the darker values, I like to paint using a slightly thicker consistency right around the edges. Then as I get towards the lighter area, I use the lighter consistency and I twirl my brush around to create uneven surfaces for a slight bit of texture to make it look puffy and also for a softer transition. Next, I'm going to paint the lights on top of the socks. For this, I'm going to create the lights as star shapes. So here I use a mix of Hansa yellow with a bit of vermilion, or you can also pick up the previous red mixture, and this will just create a slightly deeper orangey yellow. And I'm just going to try to distribute the stars as best as I can with more or less even space in between. For the string of the lights, I'm going to use green. You can use any color you would like to. I use a mix of focus green with mineral violet in a thick consistency. But like I mentioned, you can use other colors if you feel like there's a different combination that you prefer. After I finish the last star, I'm going to take off all of the masking fluid. I'm just using my finger here, and this should reveal all of the white areas that we've masked off. As you can see, those areas are not completely clean. The shape sometimes looks a bit weird, so I'm just cleaning the edges to make sure that the shapes are more or less what I want them to be. But here I'm going to move on to the berries to paint them using a dark red from a mix of mineral violet and crimson lake. I left out a bit of white negative space to help with the form. I know this shouldn't look shiny, but I just find that this helps with the roundness and it looks cute this way. So I'm also going to do the same for the round pom-poms for the sock in the middle. For this, I tried to use different colors to make it a bit more festive. For the red, I added vermilion to make it more of a warm red, and for the yellow I also warm it up with some vermilion as well to create a deeper yellow as well as orange. As for the green, I also mixed it with some Hansa yellow to make it look more lively. Moving on to the leaves of the berries, I use a darker green this time for a bit of variation, and I just use a mix of hooker's green with mineral violet. After that, I'm just going to leave them to dry and move on to the sock on the left with a pussy willow, and I'm just using a medium consistency of buff titanium to paint around those white areas. Just like the other pattern, I left out a bit of white negative space to make it look like it's puffed up. For a bit more color variation, I decided to add some leaves to the stems using the dark green I used for the berries. Then for the stems, because they're quite small and thin, I decided to just use my colored pencil. Here I'm just doing a quick fix up, hiding the little patches that I made to fix the shape of the mask areas. Then after that, I'm going to outline the socks, including the details to make them pop out a little bit more. Here I'm using my colored pencil, and the color is this dark brown close to a sepia to outline because I like the texture of the colored pencil, but you can also use ink pen if you would like. Using this pencil, I'm also going to add some finer details around the cuffs. I'm just adding small vertical lines following the angle of the socks. I've painted most of the elements now, but I want to add extra details using my bleed proof white, or you can also use white gouache. Here I'm adding white dots in the middle of the stars to make it look like it's lighting up, and I'm also going to add dots to some of the sock design as well, and I just find that this looks a bit more cute and festive. For the writing, I'm just going to use my brown pen to go over it, and don't forget to also paint the berries at the bottom as well. I'm just using vermilion straight up, and I'm painting it the same way as I did with the pom-poms earlier by leaving out a white negative space. Then for the leaves, I just used hooker's green mixed with the orangey yellow that I already had on my palette. I'm also going to add the stems using my colored pencil to make it much easier to apply with some midrib. Then I'm going to go over the bottom part to give some shadows to the berries as well using a dark red mix from Crimson Lake and Mineral Violet. Lastly, I'm going to add a bit of glow to the stars using a really light consistency Hansa yellow, and then I'm just going to finish everything off by erasing the extra pencil marks. And that's it for the first design. Let's move on straight to the second design, where I'm going to be drawing a sweater. And here I'm placing it at the center vertically, but I want to nudge it slightly higher so I have a bit of space at the bottom for the writing. You can create any shape and design you want, but for me, I want to make the sweater look kind of thick and cozy, so I want the sleeves and the bottom of the sweater to puff up a bit with smaller cuffs and hem as a comparison to the puffiness. Since just having the sweater as the design of the card would be a bit boring, I'm also going to add some leaves and dots on both sides to give a little something to the composition. I'm also going to add some circles surrounding the sweater to represent snowballs. For the text, I'm just going to use the same font, but again, for your design, you can choose any font you want. You can look up different fonts for inspiration and try to recreate it by hand. To make it cohesive with the previous design, I also drew out the small berries and leaves underneath the writing. Now for the design of the sweater, there are a lot of options. At the beginning, I thought it would be cute to do a little baby penguin, but I kind of realized that I wouldn't be able to make the color as cohesive with the previous design, and since I want to turn this into a set, I decided to just draw a wreath. I'm keeping the wreath simple with the bow at the top and also some round decorations just like the socks. Once the outline of the drawing is clean enough for me to paint on, I'm going to prep it first by masking the circular decorations on the wreath just to make the painting process easier. I'm going to wait for that to dry, and meanwhile, here are the colors I'll be using. Hansa Yellow by Daniel Smith, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Veremilion by Holbein, Mineral Violet by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Hooker's Green by Cotman, Grey of Grey by Holbein, and Cobalt Blue Hue by Holbein. I'm also going to be using my Bleed-Proof White by Dr. Paige Martens. For the outline, this time I'm going to be using 3 colors, and here are the numbers. This is the same brand by Faber-Castell, and it's just a hobby grade. The first one is sort of like a sepia, second is like a reddish brown, and the third is similar to an ochre or dark version of a yellow ochre. And just like before, I'm also going to be using my Unipen Fine Line in the color brown, and the size is 0.5. Once the masking fluid is completely dry, we're ready to paint. I'm going to paint the base color of the sweater first using a mix of buff titanium with a bit of yellow ochre, and I'm using quite a wet load on my brush because I want the color to be evenly distributed. Once I've covered the sweater with this base color, the surface should still be a bit damp considering I used a heavy load, and while the surface is still damp, I'm going to add a thicker consistency of the same mixture for a bit of a darker value, and I'm going to place them at the bottom part of the sleeves as well as the bottom part of the sweater. This is to create shadows, and it's basically the same concept as what I did to the socks, and this will just make it extra puffy. So I'm going to slowly build up on the value as well. Here I added a little bit of mineral violet into the previous mixture to create a slightly darker brown, and I'm going to place them at the edges again, then softening the transition using a clean damp brush. The surface should be a bit more dry now, and I'm going to use this opportunity to add a bit of texture using the same mixture before. I just use a thin consistency this time, and I kind of tap the side of my brush to create an uneven surface, giving this more of a fuzzy texture. Next, I'm going to paint the cuffs, neckband, and hem using a darker brown. It's basically the same mixture as before, but I added more mineral violet into the ratio to make it a bit darker. Next, I'm going to paint the wreath, and I'm going to start with the bow, and I'm going to use this maroon color mixture from a mix of vermilion, mineral violet, and crimson lake. I first used the thick consistency, then I realized that it was too thick and it would make the whole bow look too flat, so I ended up just applying it to the top part, then using a clean damp brush to pull the color downwards. While I wait for the bow to dry, I'm going to paint the decorative leaf, and for this I use a mix of Hooker's Green, Mineral Violet, and Yellow Ochre. For the dots, I'm going to turn them into berries, and I'm just going to use the consistency of vermilion, and I'm painting it the same way as I did with all the other circular things in this design, which is to leave a little bit of white space for highlights. Next, I want to paint the green for the wreath, and I'm basically using the same mixture with added Hansa yellow to make it a little bit lighter. And here I adjusted the mixture with the other colors as well because I still want the green to be a bit muted. After I've covered the whole wreath, I'm going to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency of the same mix. I also use a slightly darker value, and I'm placing this randomly by dotting the tip of my brush around. I also added them underneath the masked areas, and this will just help lift the decorations as I paint them later on. Using the same dark green, I'm going to add a bit of the red mixture, and this will create a brown that I'm going to use to paint the stems. And with that brown, I'm going to add it to the red mixture to create a dark red for the shadow underneath the berries. Then using the same red for the base color of the bow, I just added the outline as well as a little bit of detail. Next, I'm going to paint the snowballs using a mix of cobalt blue with gray of gray to create this pastel blue, and I'm just going to use a thick consistency to outline those circles. Then to paint the rest of the circle, I just use a clean damp brush to pull the color from the outline inwards. I think I'm ready to paint the decoration on the wreath now, so I'm going to take off the masking fluid and also erase the extra pencil marks. Just like the sock from the previous design, I'm starting with vermilion to paint the pom-poms or the decorations on the wreath, and I'm just spreading it out, also leaving a little bit of negative space to make these decorations pop. I then added some Hansa yellow to create an orange and even more Hansa yellow for a deeper yellow color. And those are just the colors that I'm going to use for the decoration. After this, I'm going to start adding on the details using my colored pencil. I'm using the darkest brown to add on the details of the cuffs, hem, and neckband. I'm treating this like the cuffs of the socks by just adding vertical lines close together. After this, I decided to outline the whole sweater, but at this point, considering I haven't added any more details, I thought that just using this brown is enough with the addition of the darkest brown. And I'm also going to line the wreath, but later on, I'm actually just going to line it using the darkest brown instead. Since the sweater is looking very empty, I decided to add more Christmassy pattern using the reddish brown. And you can create different designs. You can look up on Google, or if you have your own sweaters as inspiration, you can take some of the patterns that you like and include it in your illustration. For the pattern, I like to play with lines and geometric shapes. I also like to play with the weight of those lines and make sure that these details are thick enough to be seen. After adding on the similar pattern on the sleeves, I still felt like it looks a bit empty, so I'm extending it upwards and I'm going to include some stars similar to the lights that I painted earlier for the previous design. And after I've reached halfway up the sleeve, I felt like I have enough design now without it looking like it's overcrowding the sweater, but I do want to add a bit more texture. And as for the texture, I switched to the lightest brown pencil because I don't want the texture to take away the rest of the design, and I'm just doing really random dashed lines. After that, I'm going to write Merry Christmas using my brown pen. For the berries and the leaves underneath the writing, I'm just going to treat it the same way as the previous design. So I've pretty much painted all of the elements here, but looking at the design again, I felt like it still looks a bit flat. So I decided to use the same base color to add a bit of a darker value at the bottom of the sweater. And as I get towards the top, I'm going to turn it into a bit of texture by tapping my brush to exaggerate the uneven surface. I'm also going to darken the green of the wreath to give a bit more contrast to the color of the decoration and the green. Then I'm also going to add some white dots for extra decoration using bleed-proof white to make the wreath look less dense. While I still have the bleed-proof white, I'm also going to add this to the pattern, just adding dots in between the diamond shapes. I decided to add more pattern, but this time I'm using bleed-proof white so it doesn't have much contrast and it kind of just blends in to the rest of the texture on the sweater. I decided to add more star shapes, but you can also do dots if you would like to, or any pattern you have in mind. Lastly, after adding on all the details for the pattern, the previous outline just wasn't strong enough, so I decided to re-outline the sweater using the darkest brown pencil to define the edges further. And this is the completed card. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more like this, please consider subscribing. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thanks so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!